It gets worse every week.
So know your bishop. So we're this week we're going to talk about Welby, Bishop Welby. Okay, so is did the screen, is it just Bishop Welby up there on your screen?
There he is, Bishop Welby.
All right, so just a little bit of background on him. He was born in 1956 in London. His parents were Gavin Welby and Jane Welby. She was born Jane Portal. They were divorced when Justin was 3 years old. And they were both alcoholics.
Goodness.
Oh.
So he had kind of a rough beginning in life. Jane Portal, until she was married, actually worked for Winston Churchill. She was Winston Churchill's personal secretary.
Really? Wow.
Yep. I thought that was an interesting tidbit.
And she became an alcoholic.
Yeah, well, I guess a rough time.
Well, probably had a tipple or two with Churchill.
With Churchill, yeah.
He was known to like his booze all time of the day.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
I bet she smoked cigars, too.
I don't know. I didn't find anything about that. So Justin studied at Eton College, Trinity College in Cambridge, and he had a master's degree in history and law. And he actually worked in that field for quite a few years in the industry. He was a financial executive in the petroleum industry, where he spent most of his secular career before being called to the priesthood.
Yes.
And while working in France, he was a member of the council in St. Michael's Church in Paris. And after returning to London, he became a lay leader at Holy Trinity. And so he and his wife, Caroline, they have several children together. In 1983, their 7-month-old daughter died in a car crash in France. And he is quoted as saying, "It was a very dark time for my wife, Carolyn, and myself, but in a strange way, it actually brought us closer to God." And somehow this horrible experience did bring him closer to God and began his life towards, ministry eventually, which amazes me because I went through a horrible thing with my daughter, and it did the opposite for me. It drove me away from God. I became an atheist for several years. So it's interesting for someone to go through a tragedy like that, how people respond differently to it. I don't know why that is, but this is the way he and his wife both responded to that tragedy. 1989, he left industry and entered the seminary. And in 1992, graduated with a bachelor's degree and a diploma in theology from St. John's College. And had a particular interest in banking and corporate ethics, as well as conflict resolution and reconciliation, which is not...
Isn't that an oxymoron?
What's that?
Isn't that an oxymoron?
Yeah, well, I guess with his background in finance and industry and corporate big oil corporations is what interested in. That's a blending of his background with theology, seeking God. And interestingly, a lot of his work and writings are in reconciliation. And he wrote a book. I tried to read it. I couldn't understand it because it was all financial aspects. It's beyond me. I don't understand finance. But it was somehow equating, making a connection between living as a Christian and the corporate financial world. Like you said, kind of an oxymoron, right? But his dissertation at St. John's became a basis of an influential pamphlet that he wrote, Can Companies Sin? 1992. I guess if corporations can, they can sin, right?
Well, think about the things like, working children in factories and,
yeah,
in the funds.
Right. We certainly create environments that are not godly and harmful to people.
And unsafe working conditions, particularly now with the virus going around.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting that his book was published the year he graduated from the seminary?
Yeah,
Oh, it's a dissertation, I see.
it was just it was a pamphlet, and he did write a couple other books recently. I think after becoming Archbishop, actually. So 92, he was ordained a deacon. 93, he was ordained to be priest. And then he became rector of St. James Church in Southam and St. Michael's of All Angels, and actually active in both those churches. He helped grow those churches. They became more vital and active, and they grew in size with his leadership. He became canon of Coventry Cathedral, and then subdean of Coventry Cathedral. Coventry Cathedral is pictured here, and there's an interesting story to tell you about that in a minute. He was also co-director of Coventry Cathedral's International Center for Reconciliation, where he worked with, he did a lot of work internationally with problems, with helping to settle tensions and problems. For example, in 2005, he negotiated a peace settlement between Shell Oil Company and the Ogoni people of Nigeria. Shell had polluted the groundwater, and he helped lead to some resolution on that problem. He's met with Israeli and Palestinian leaders in trying to work towards more peace. He worked on reopening Anglican Church in Baghdad. So he did a lot of stuff with high-profile, stressful situations and trying to bring more peace and harmony and lead people towards working with each other. And so reconciliation has been a big part of his ministry as a priest and as a bishop. So then he became priest in charge at Holy Trinity, which was the city's largest Anglican church. Later named dean of the largest cathedral in England, which is Liverpool, and eventually became bishop in 2011. And of course, he has served on Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards. He succeeded Rowan Williams, and Rowan Williams was vehemently opposed to ordination of women and ordination of openly gay homosexual bishops, and against same-sex marriages. Welby is much softer on it, but the Church of England still has not come that far. Now they have ordained women, but they have not come as far as we have in terms of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. But Welby is definitely softer on it, softened the tone on it. It seems more open towards that kind of stuff, certainly than his predecessor was. So, quote from his installation sermon when he became Archbishop, there is every possible reason for optimism about the future of Christian faith in this world and this country. The present environment and economic challenges and those of human development and global poverty can only be faced with extraordinary Christ-liberated courage. The Church transforms society when it takes the risks of renewal and prayer, of reconciliation, and of confident declaration of the good news of Jesus Christ. So this is from his sermon when he was installed, and I share this with you because he talked about prayer and reconciliation, which are two of the big themes when you read his writings and his sermons. Those are two of his big themes that recur in his ministry over and over again. So when he became Archbishop, those became focuses for him for the church: renewal of prayer throughout the church and seeking reconciliation within the church. Some of the things he has said on prayer. Prayer is one of the most beautiful activities human beings can engage, whether alone or with others. Prayer is how we establish our true identity as individuals and as the church. In prayer, our identity is changed to be more aligned with the identity of God, the identity that in love we are called towards. As Mother Teresa said, prayer enlarges the heart until it's capable of obtaining God's gift of himself. When we pray, we participate in the most dramatic partnership of creation and recreation. A partnership with God that involves gazing on his creation in the events of the world he has made and seeking that they be conformed to his likeness and image. So there again, you see this tone of reconciliation, reconciling things that are wrong with the world to what God would have the world be. We are changed and the world is changed. And the world is changed. God allows through prayer to share in his making of the world. We are his partners in making the world in prayer. Welby says partnership with Jesus Christ in prayer is risky because it's deeply costly. When we accept the invitation of Jesus to be with him, it will mean putting ourselves in places that are tough, putting ourselves to limits that are demanding. So prayer is apparently looking at it from the outside, a fearful thing and deeply risky. The reality, of course, is that the risk is nothing. It's a zero. To cast yourself into the hands of one who loves you immeasurably and perfectly is fairly obviously not much of a risk. Not to do so is really the risk, but it feels like a risk because in prayer, that is a partnership with God, everything is on the table and we hold nothing back. Prayer causes huge collateral damage to all of our vanity and our ambition and our hopes of self-advancement and self-centeredness. Being in partnership with God reveals to us our true identity, not the bad things that many of us feel about ourselves, but the sheer beauty that is what God feels about us because of what he did on the cross. And it reveals God to us in his true identity, and we can never again be the same. So those are some of Justin Welby's thoughts and comments and writings on prayer, which I find to be very deep and profound and true. So back to the Coventry Cathedral. There's a story with Coventry, and it has to do with the cross of nails. So Coventry Cathedral was badly damaged, as you see here in 1940, by the German bombs. A lot of the city was destroyed. And this was a medieval cathedral built in the 1300s. And as you see, it was mostly destroyed. And what happened in the days after all of this destruction, one of the priests of the cathedral found these two very large beams that had landed on top of the altar in the shape of a cross and found that to be symbolic. He took some of the nails out of those beams, and these nails were from 1326. So he took some of those ancient medieval nails and he created a cross with it. And it became known as the Cross of Nails. And there's a picture of the Cross of Nails that he created is still up in Coventry where you can see it. Now the significance of this is that he said within weeks after this event of the bombing, he went on a radio broadcast and made a statement that when this war is over, we want to build a more Christ-like world. We want to seek reconciliation with the Germans, especially amongst the churches, between the churches and the Christians of England and Germany. So here they were just being bombed, and this priest is already talking about reconciliation. There was still quite a bit of war yet to go, but he's already looking forward to that. And indeed they did. In the 50s, they made replicas of the Cross of Nails and presented them to Lutheran churches in Germany, and Kiel and Dresden and Berlin and other cities that were also destroyed by Allied bombings. And this was working towards reconciliation between the Christians of Germany and the Christians of England, and between the churches and between the cities. And it became symbolic and helped to make progress in healing.
Just one thing, David, that Dresden was selected by Churchill as the city that received bombs from the British, who didn't have much in the way of aircraft, but they bombed that Dresden, and there was a firestorm, and they bombed it just directly in retaliation for bombing a civilian city like Coventry.
Did they really? Yeah. War is horrible.
Dresden, Germany.
The Cross of Nails has become kind of a society too. Now it's there's a website about it, and it's always, Cross of Nails is always used for healing war-torn nations, or seeking reconciliation where there's conflict. And there's the picture now, Coventry, just comparing the two, you can see the remnants of what was left and the picture on the right and the rebuilding of the Coventry Cathedral, where of course Bishop Welby spent a great deal of his time as a priest. I believe it's where he was our priest, actually.
It's a bomb that the church, there's no back wall.
So Welby wears a replica of the Cross of Nails. That's the cross he wears around him. Around his neck is a replica of the Cross of Nails. And he's presented a Cross of Nails to war-torn nations in Africa and other places. He presented one to the Pope in 2016. So again, that's one of the two big themes of Welby's ministry is prayer, and the other is reconciliation. And the Cross of Nails is one of the symbols he uses. On the topic of reconciliation, Welby says, reconciliation is one of our greatest needs and toughest challenges as human beings. In a world plagued by conflict, division, and indifference, the church has a crucial role to play as a community of reconcilers. Jesus calls every one of us to love God, our neighbors, ourselves, and our enemies, a challenging command with nobody left out. And of course, the word literally means to bring together or heal that which was broken. The healing is much more than the absence of conflict. It's certainly not about suppressing difference. Reconciliation is about seeking to transform relationships that have become damaged or destructive into relationships of trust that bring new life. Those are all words of Justin Welby, of course. The journey is not easy. It requires humility, time, and patience.
Hey,
yeah.
I have a question for you. Are you going to have a printout of all this for us, possibly?
I can.
All these facts, all these facts that you're presenting, I would love to have it to be able to study it more slowly.
Certainly.
Unless that's way too much, labor involved, don't worry about it.
It's not really a problem at all. I'm just making myself a note so I do it later. If I don't write it down, I'll forget. Oh, sure.
Well, thank you very much.
Most of all, reconciliation demands decision to let go of the destructive power of memory and past hurt. It's precisely because reconciliation is so difficult that it is so powerful. And I have to say that that's certainly a true statement in your own life, not just between war-torn nations or institutions, but just in your own life. When you reconcile with somebody, it is difficult, and that difficulty that makes it so powerful. I think he's true. I think he's right. So the Archbishop of Canterbury has some interesting other duties. For one, the Archbishop of Canterbury is a senior member of the House of Lords, and has been that way for centuries. So he's a member of Parliament. Actually, there are several bishops that are members of Parliament. There's 26 bishops of the Church of England who are known as the Lords Spiritual. Once a year, he invites all the armed forces chaplains to Lambeth Palace to talk through key issues and listen to their concerns and experiences. And Lambeth Palace, by the way, is in London, and it is a palace designated for the Archbishop of Canterbury. Again, this is something that's been going on for centuries. And there it is. There's Lambeth Palace.
I wonder how the wiring and the plumbing are.
Yeah. You know, like all of those ancient historic castles and palaces in Europe, and including England, they're built over the course of centuries. You know, the initial building on this was, I think, the 14th century, if I remember correctly. And of course, you know, it's continuously added on and improved. So I imagine it all has fine electricity and plumbing at this point.
Well, I'd be very
The
careful.
aqueduct still work real well.
I'd be very careful with the definition of fine plumbing. You know?
Yeah.
But Lambeth is on the Surrey side of the River Thames. It's not actually on the same side as the House of Parliament or Westminster Abbey or anything. So
Interesting. It's also used for charitable events and organizations. And actually, I think the bishop has some refugees living on the grounds right now. Interesting, because he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, yet London's about, how far? About an hour and a half train ride, Peter?
yes, if that.
So I find that interesting that there's such a great distance between the palace that they gave the Archbishop and where he is Archbishop of, especially, you know, well, today we've got trains and planes and automobiles, but, you know, in the 1400s when they started doing this, it was probably a pretty major trip to go from one place to the other. I'm sure he would have gone and spent some great deal of time at Lambeth Palace before going back to Canterbury.
Yes.
But I guess the responsibilities of a bishop involve a lot of travel to all the churches anyway, so he probably doesn't spend all of his time at Canterbury anyway. Being the Archbishop of the Anglican Communion, he's got to go all over the world. But I find that interesting. They gave him a palace so far away from where he's technically assigned to be bishop.
Yes.
Lambeth Palace Library houses the largest religious collection outside of the Vatican. Oh, there you go. It started being built in 1200. So there's the beginning of Lambeth Palace. So something has been there for 800 years now. And like Peter just said, it's on the south bank of the Thames. And a little bit about his family. He met his wife, Caroline, at the University of Cambridge. And they have 5 living children. As we know, they had one child died in infancy in a car wreck. One of his daughters, depression. His son and daughter that are married. Not to pry into his personal life, but I think this tells us a little bit of some of the difficulties that he deals with in his own life. So I find him an interesting character. I have a hard time putting together someone who's a petroleum finance person. Odd, seems like an odd juxtaposition to become a priest and a bishop. But apparently he's doing a fine job and seems to be well respected and has a lot of good things to say about reconciliation and prayer. So,
Well, David, we need to remember that St. Paul wasn't very much of a good Christian early on in his life.
well, it's true. It's true.
Look at that. So God works in mysterious and wonderful ways.
Yes, absolutely. And I didn't even mean that. I hope that didn't sound judgmental. I wasn't meaning that in judgmental. I just find that it's a big change. It's a big shift. And I think it's interesting. I find that interesting.
Yeah.
Well, also you have to take in account that being head of a church, like any CEO job, requires a lot of business acumen.
Right?
And I think it's quite appropriate and a natural transition from a secular industry to a sectarian industry enterprise. And he's applied those skills equally. So,
Yes, I think you're right. Yep. Certainly a lot of transferable skills. Anyway. Yeah, and he has written a couple books. Like I said, I tried to read one, and totally beyond me to understand it. So, but
I find his comments,
What's the
his ministry emphasis on reconciliation as something really that's quite current. In
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had a lot of good things to say about reconciliation. It's certainly all over our country and our world deeply needed, more so than in previous parts of my life. Well,
Is Welby still alive?
oh yeah, he's still the Archbishop. He's the current Archbishop of the Church of England.
Oh, okay.
Well, he's leading the
Getting up in age, I would guess. Huh?
That's a good question. Let's ask Google.
Did you ask how old he was?
How old is Bishop Welby?
About 70 maybe? 68?
He's born in 1956. He's 64 years old.
Okay.
All right.
Younger than I thought. Okay.
Yeah, he could be bishop for another 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
What is his term in office, you know? What is his term in office?
There is not a term.
He can serve forever?
It's until he wishes to relinquish it. It's
Interesting.
not like here where the House of Bishops elects you for a period of time. There, you're appointed to the Archbishop and you're in it for as long as you want to be in it or can succeed to do it.
So it's more similar to the Pope then.
Except he's essentially the Pope of the Anglican Church.
Actually, yeah, right.
Yes.
So we don't ascribe him infallibility.
No.
That's good.
Yeah.
Legitimate children too.
He's not only head of the Anglican Church, he's head of the whole, he's over the whole of the
Anglican Communion.
Anglican Communion, yes.
Yeah, right, for sure. So he is also our Archbishop in a way, even though
Until they kick us out for our heresies. Until they kick us out for our heresies.
Yeah, there's a little tension there because of our.
Not under him. I don't think there's any danger under him. Under the previous one, Rowan Williams.
Yes. Yeah, the previous one was very much opposed to homosexuality and opposed to women being ordained. So,
yeah.
It's been an
One statement, David, that he had about prayer, that there was nothing dangerous about praying.
Well, just that it's personally risky. He says it can seem on the surface to be risky, but in reality not, was what he was saying.
Well, I think, I found that an interesting statement because probably if you have an inordinate amount of faith, that might be the case. But if you don't have an inordinate amount of faith, I think it's a lot harder to accept that as a fact.
Yeah, interesting. Yep, I agree with you.
My feelings with talking about his family looks like pretty many struggles, is that probably would contribute to an increased feeling of compassion and understanding with everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. And that's why I wanted the family life in here, just to give you a picture of what he's like in terms of the things he has to deal with and how it affects him and his ministry. So,